all right. Let's get it started. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for watching this final, I guess, lecture video. Um, I'm just gonna get into it. Whew. So I think you all know I grew up south side of Chicago, um, and part of my I first was engaged to Catholic schools in first grade, St. Gerard Magella, in the south suburbs actually of Chicago, a city called Markham. Um, at this time, Markham was a predominantly white, well, this area of Markham anyway, was a predominantly white neighborhood. School was predominantly, but not exclusively white, but Markham and its neighboring city, Harvey, at the time of in the 1970s, were slowly becoming integrated to a point where in the last 20 years has been pretty much exclusively black. Um, but yeah, that's why I was introduced to Catholicism. No one in my family was Catholic. Again, like as some of you know, my grandfather was a Baptist minister. My grandmother on my dad's side, that's on my mom's side. My paternal family are all Protestants. It was what drew me into the Catholic Church was the Catholic school, and later on I'm gonna mention that's not a new story, but I want to kind of begin with this. There's a name that you'll see on your list. Well, I may not because it don't really matter in the history of black religion, so maybe I won't. But I just want to begin with this name because one of the first interesting things to me when I started learning history was Jean Baptiste Point du Sable. Now, again, you don't have to remember or write it. You write it down. Jean Baptiste, right? Point Pointe du Sable. Obviously, he was a Frenchman, and but and obviously his claim to fame, to look him up, he is the founder of what we know of as Chicago. Okay. Um, Now, why do I mention him? Because one of the interesting things in history that I learned was Jean Baptiste du Sable was Catholic. And so devout of a Catholic, although he married a Native American woman, he actually was, the story of his historic story says that he was, it was, that the marriage was um, confirmed, or I forgot the right word for it, but by a Catholic priest. Um, Now, why is this important? Because this is 1818, 1819, right? So at the very least, we can go back to the early 19th century, but I could probably take you further than that. But if we understand the 19th century as maybe a launching point for this conversation, it's a lot easier for me. Although well, maybe I'll say that in a minute. Um, the question really becomes a broader question, like how does America, irrespective of Black America, but how does America become Catholic? Because remember, the British Empire wasn't Catholic. The Spanish was, the French was, but not the British. So how did America become chiefly Catholic, especially when we were supposedly trying to escape religious persecution, right? Well, beginning in about the 19th century, right, we know that in America, Catholics were kind of, to be honest, they were kind of feared themselves and despised as an immigrant population to a nation, i.e., America, that seen itself more Protestant, right? America was a Protestant country, not Catholic. And so when Catholics began to immigrate into America, quite frankly, it became a problem in the 19th century. So much of a problem that you have history of stories about Catholic churches and convents being burned down and torn down, and priests and nuns being abused and killed and raped. By the early part of the 20th century, Catholics became one of the victims of the Ku Klux Klan's activity. So put that in the context of the very origin, the very inculcation of Catholics in general in America, even before we kind of talk about black and Catholic, right? Around the Second World War, given the way in which European immigrants become a little bit more, meshed into society, right? More education, serving in the military, growth of the suburbs, right? You don't literally see Catholics as different than Protestants. True undertone to that, you began to see they were just white Americans. Yes, they may have had certain nationalities, Polish, right, Italian, Irish, more specifically. But I mentioned around World War II because the big transition in terms of America's at least fascination, or at least acceptance, I never say fascination, acceptance of Catholic folk came when? In 1960. What happened in 1960? If you had to guess, John F. Kennedy. Right. So now we have a president who both in symbol and in practice changed the way we looked at Catholics and Irish at the same time. It took a while before Catholics kind of gained its foothold, but slowly but surely, Catholics began to ingratiate themselves in the politics of the area, governmental service, to a point where arguably, the numbers of even Catholic members of the United States Congress expanded. At one point, I understand around 2006, by the time Obama, 2016, right, about 1/3 of the members of Congress were actually Catholic. And that's the positive story, the story of how you can go from an Irish, chiefly, French, Eastern European immigrants who were not really welcomed in America as much. And at one point, we know in World War I, he actually shut it down. Right? That story is different, as you can imagine, from being black Catholics in America. To be black and to be Catholic, that coming to be, that burgeoning reality, become just about as political and just about as ardent and difficult as you would probably imagine. To be black and to be Catholic in America. under the overarching aegis of white supremacy, just created such a awesome responsibility. There's a story that you'll see if you watch the video that is attached of Father Michael Pfleger. He tells a story about he knew he wanted to do some work in civil rights when he saw Martin King come in town and the white police force, who at that time was overwhelmingly Irish, were attacking and even shooting and maiming people of color. This chiefly after what? The death of Martin King. Sorry, I meant the death of King, not him visiting. Sorry. Even though there were riots when he visited. But I'm talking about after the death of King, the riots that took place in Chicago. So you imagine now around 68, 69, 70, across the nation, especially in urban areas, you're seeing the rise of the Black Power movement. And Black Catholics found themselves aligned in many ways with some of the Black Power language. One name I want you to think about it, not that he's a huge name in history, but I may or may not even have him on your test, but is Herman Porter from Illinois. What was important about Herman Porter is that he organized the first official sort of meeting of Black Catholics at a time which Black Power was growing. It is said that 58 priests gathered to draft a manifesto and created a national Black Catholic movement. So again, the Black Catholic clergy in Detroit, Michigan was where they convened it. Father Porter Herman Porter was from Rockford, Illinois, but the meeting took place in Detroit. At this time in this meeting, these 58 priests, they begin to sort of say, hey, the United States Church itself is complicit with white supremacy. And the bottom line was, in cities like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Baltimore and New Orleans in a minute, but these Black churches need to be ran by Black folk. Or they would look at it, these churches in Black communities that are being operated and perished by white priests, according to these 53 priests, need to be ran by Black folk. Black Power movement fought for self-defense. And even in this particular Congress with my brother Herman Porter, he said, look, we even have to protect ourselves. We need to respond violence with violence if push came to proverbial shove. And you know you wasn't having that with King, right? He says Black Catholics literally need to lead the Catholic Church in the Black communities. So think back to the language that I gave a couple weeks ago, last week. Right? The God for black people, if you will. Unless the church unless the church is going to sort of make a 360 with its stand on racism and its practices and its structure, then unless you're going to do that as an institution within its ranks and within its hierarchy, then the Catholic Church don't need no black folk if you ain't going to do that. Or you need to let us run our own thing. Right? So again, it's not a huge name in history, but Father Porter, Herman Porter, started that first sort of organized black Catholic organization for priests. But don't leave the sisters out. Sister Gray, Martin de Porres Gray, Martine de Porres. She was named that, which is become a nun. You got to get named. It's a whole story, but she founded the National Black Sisters Conference, where she, similar to Brother Porter, says, we church sisters, we nuns, we need to be in part and parcel of the liberation of black people. Pretty radical, right? Liberation what? Theology, right? Denounced racism, called it part and parcel of the church. This is around what, 69, 70? Right? So that's important to think about historically. Now, like I said, my general knowledge of black Catholics kind of began in the 19th century. But, thinking about those organizations that took hold in the 20th century, black Catholics kind of have been around, especially when you think of them of African descent, as long as there's been Catholics in America. Any history book in America will probably tell you about the Moroccan brother Esteban, or Estebanaco. Popular in a lot of books. Why? Because he was sent to these parts in the 1530s. Thinking there was some gold somewhere in these parts. Esteban, look him up. You probably already seen him in some, if you took any history, well, I don't know, any history class, but any American history class, especially any black American history class, they probably would mention Esteban. But the point is, he was a Catholic brother from Morocco. Right? And we think about, he actually died on the way. He didn't make it to shore. He died, but he's still in the history books though. There were some Catholics from the Congo. And the reason why that's important, because we think about, now here's a historic term you should know, the Stono Rebellion. S-T-O-N-O, rebellion. Took place in South Carolina. Mid-18th century, 1730, 1740, I forgot the year. But you'll look that up because that's going to be one of your terms. Stono Rebellion. Why? Because it was chiefly Catholic slaves that rose up against their master and created one of the largest slave uprisings before the Revolutionary War. And they did it strategically on the day that honors the birth of the Virgin Mary. So again, there's probably more history that I can't lie to you. I don't have much of the pre-19th century history under my corpus. But the point is, not all Catholics that crossed the Atlantic Ocean were white. And as we've talked about before, it needs to be clear that not all black folk immediately were Protestants at all as well. We had a whole host of spiritual practices. All right. But what did the 20th century do? Well, the 20th century brought some, pretty strong developments, to black Catholics, right? As we talked about in the book, the big migration from south to north, right? The black migrants moved into sort of these big Catholic areas, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. And a lot of these white Catholics resisted this sort of black ingress, if you will, into their communities. And what you probably already know of, heard of, I know there's been some campus talk about this. One of the strategic elements that many used to sort of stave off black folk moving into certain neighborhoods was redlining or racial covenants. Right? And if you hadn't already heard this conversation, the reason this conversation is on campus lately is because it was introduced by a documentary, but it's been talked about people like me and others for a while, because the very neighborhood right down the street, Ridgewood, and its architect, Kessler, was the national founder of redlining, or racial covenants, housing covenants, that ended up leading to the banking process called redlining. But I digress. That's a piece of history, right down the street, right down Fountain. Began a national conversation around how to keep black folk out. And quite frankly, it ain't too many black folk in Ridgewood even right now, if we're being honest about it. There's a couple though. But when I ran for office, trust me, a lot of them they knew me. They still was like, some people were like, that's some big black Negro walking around. Some people knocking on doors, other trying to do something. Somebody called, oh, that's Dr. Belly from Wittenberg. Oh, really? Oh, okay. All I know is black people walking around with T-shirts. Are they a gang? What they doing? No, they're running for office. Why are you tripping? Anyway. But, as you can imagine, with more black ingress comes what? White flight. Right? So let me move a little faster. So with this white flight, you have then these churches like I grew up in, or grew up going to church in, school and church in, where you still have this interesting mix of white people, white nuns and priests all on the wall, and some in the parishes, and some still teaching, blah, blah, blah. But pretty much everybody on their way out the door gone. And so you had this big influx of black folk going to these churches, and white folk leaving these parishes and moving to the suburbs. Right. It is arguable that from World War II on, from after World War II on, there were some, by invitation, especially the liberal ones, the missionaries of the Catholic Church, invited black parents to enroll their children, gave scholarships, helped them, right? Introduced them to Catholic rituals and Catholic habits and Catholic prayers and sacraments. broadening the way in which they saw the world through religion. And these Catholic school encounters, like I started this lecture with, resulted in tens and tens and tens of thousands of African Americans becoming Catholic. And like I said, in my city alone, in Chicago, it is said that in 1990 there was one parish that had a few black people in it, basically fit in the crib. I mean, in 1900, 70 years later, by 1970, right before I was about to come on the scene, 80,000 black folk were Catholic in Chicago. It became the second largest black population in America, behind what? Baltimore. Or I'm sorry, behind Detroit. They had passed Baltimore. Sorry. And that's an important piece that I probably end with. Just remind me, or you can't remind me. Baltimore and New Orleans. Remember that. Talk about their importance in this conversation. But so again, around 1970, 1975, right, this big burgeoning growth of black Catholics, right, to arguably, like I say, just in Chicago alone, we're talking what, 80,000, and it grew eventually across America around the same time to about 300,000. It's huge growth. Right? And this growth also was what? The growth of black power, black organization. What have you already seen with black organization? Malcolm X Organization for Afro-American Unity, Black Panther Party, right? Stokely Carmichael, folks like that. SNCC, Southern Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They're already in play, but the SNCC was getting big now because King is dead. SCLC wasn't as proper without King no more. And so the Black Power movement itself inspired many black Catholics as trying to change the culture from previously being a white racist institution to being more progressive and engaged. And so the Black Catholic movement, if you will, in the late 70s then became an important conversation because they themselves, especially in cities I know in Chicago, they formed a lot of political alliances with revolutionary organizations. Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party. Yeah, Catholics were down with them. Why? The protection of people is important. Engaged with my former boss, Reverend Jackson, Operation Bread Basket that became Operation Push, which then grew chiefly, out of SCLC, especially after King died. Then obviously with the growth of more black people, what do you have? What we've been talking about. Culture means worship styles, dance, music, the African drum, things like that. Intellectual contributions, right? Black folk are now going to college, becoming ordained, also getting masters and PhDs, engaging wholeheartedly in the Catholic Church. Right down the street, a popular brother in Dayton at UD founded the National Office of Black Catholics, Brother Joseph Davis. Right down the street, right? So Catholics became real political. And it kind of burgeoned, grew to about the apex, maybe around 1984, 85, when we had like 10 black bishops in the United States alone. One of which I'm going to attach a video to watch, which I told you about, who's now a cardinal. And Wilton Gregory. So, let me just kind of wrap this up. My understanding or my interest, you might remember I got in trouble a lot because I created an organization at my seminary. Well, I didn't create it. I guess I was a co-founder, but I really was the mouthpiece as a freshman of the organization called the United Black Seminarians, UBS, United Black Seminarians. And for me, it was for us to sort of stave off the erasure, the disintegration of black Catholics, and more so black Catholics and our cultural impact within the church. When I was in school, a lot of people, it wasn't a hard thing to say, oh, what school you went to? You went to Catholic school. That wasn't hard. Nowadays, ask your friends, how many of y'all, black friends, how many of y'all went to how many of you went to Catholic schools? Not as many. Quite frankly, a lot of us may not even know anybody's Catholic. Be shocked to know somebody's Catholic. I know when I first heard Kobe Bryant, I had no idea that Kobe Bryant was Catholic. Did you know that? I had no idea. So what I've attached to you also is something I've been doing research on in the last few weeks, thinking about, actually hoping I was going to talk to a priest about this, but of course we didn't get that opportunity. But there's a document I'm going to send you called the Pew Research Center document. This document kind of, and I participated in the poll survey, but the actual document came out middle of the year last year. And there's interesting finds in there. I'm just going to highlight a couple. I'm going to attach the whole thing in case anybody's interested. There will be a question for those who are going to do the final written side of the paper. You may choose that one. But for those who, let me give you some quick things to think about. Well, first of all, it tells us that 6% of black Americans today are Catholics. It's a small percentage, but what does that mean? That still means that 6% of those in America, that's about still 3 million folk. So there's 3 million black Catholics in America. Just stop and think about that. Whereas you can think about, I didn't even know so-and-so was Catholic. Now realize that, hey, it's about 3 million black folk in America that's Catholic. Where they at? Well, we got two in our class. You didn't even know. Well, one you knew about me, obviously. But you got somebody else who I know that's Catholic in your class. Right? But understand this, though. You have to you have to be expansive in your understanding nowadays about what it means to be black and Catholic in America. Because America is a huge melting pot now, right? So this study also talks about the fact that you got some sub-Saharan Africans, Caribbean-born folk, and all of them who are considered themselves Catholic, but they're also black. And so in the research study, you'll see that about 5%, I identified like myself, and I had to fill it out, as U.S.-born black. So the one thing to take away is that to be black and Catholic in America means you're likely from the diaspora. It's not as if you got 3 million brothers named Jamal. sister's name Letitia up in the black churches. But the other thing, like I said, you know, we got them now in the Conference of Bishops, College of Cardinals. Right? The Pew Research thing also said real quickly that only 17% of black Catholics attend a predominantly black church. Right? So less than 2 out of 10 actually go to a predominantly black church. I'd be willing to bet you if this was done in 1985, 89, there would be at least tripled. But let's be real about it. Here you got a brother who was about to become a priest, but the sisters messed me up. The church has got to be a little bit more expansive when it comes to this question of marriage. Now, some of you might think, well, black men ain't trying to get married anyway. It's a whole other sociological problem. I ain't talking about that. But black men ain't trying to be celibate either. So one of the problems is that we ain't becoming priests. So we're not becoming priests, and what does that mean? We can't lead churches. And if we can't lead churches, that means that parishioners are not going to just want to kind of go to a church in which, like we said back when they started the Congress of Black Catholics, they don't want to sit up here and listen to somebody who isn't speaking to their particular needs. So that's why I pay attention. Those of you who are going to do it, pay attention to the ex credit piece that I gave the interview with me and Father Flager. Again, he is a white priest that made a decision to go into a black community, do work. But listen to the work that he does. Listen to the type of worship, the integration. Just if you're interested, just Google Saint Sabina liturgy or Saint Sabina Mass in Chicago, or go to the Saint Sabina website, the faith community of saintsabina.org. In the Pew Research piece, it said that, look, only about 40% of Catholics heard a homily, a sermon on race in a year before the survey. 4 every 10. And all that's going on, this is 2022, and all that's going on, these churches aren't speaking to the day-to-day needs of black folk. And what's even worse, that's even a black folk. What's even worse is over 30% reported hearing a homily just on political engagement anyway. Go vote. Look at this issue, blah, blah, blah. The Catholic Church is historically conservative. And they don't like to get involved politically per se, unless it's conservative. Right? Social conservatives. So, 77% of black Catholics says that opposition to racism is essential to what being a Christian means. But yet, 41% of them only heard a conversation or a discussion in the pulpit on race. So close to 80% of your population says that we need to be in opposition to racism. 80% of them feel that. But yet, other 80%, only 40% of them report even hearing Pastor Father so-and-so talk about it in church. And so many black Catholics are just not getting the message that they need, right? And most of the data that was collected, began around the George Floyd thing, about 2020. And that what black Catholics begin to go further away from church as we look about things that's been going on the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And young adults, your age, a little bit older than you, they sure ain't going. So, a couple quick names again. You're gonna see on your identification thing, and I'm gonna let you go. First, some of the responses, like I said, was in organizations, but black Catholic nuns had a especially difficult problem. There's a name I want you to have right down: Mary Elizabeth Lange, Lange, Mary Elizabeth Lange, and she's the founder of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. The Oblate Sisters is very popular, very foundational, the oldest organization among black nuns in America. And they were about 1829 when they founded it, when Mary Lange founded it. 1829, pre-war. Then after the Oblate Sisters, Oblate, right? The Oblate Sisters, that covenant of nuns. The next one that came along, which I knew more about growing up, is the Sisters of the Holy Family. They were in Louisiana. Oh, I'm sorry. The Oblate Sisters of Providence, Mary Lange founded that 1829 in Baltimore. The Sisters of the Holy Family, 1842, New Orleans. Important piece. So you think about that time period. And so the black community in that, since that, what, 206, 7 years, 5 years or whatever, where have we gotten since then? What have we experienced since maybe 200 years of direct organized involvement? We still ain't got no black saints, American saints. We got my boy Augustine, that's my dude, from Northern Africa. But we ain't no black American saints. No black American popes, told you about that. There's some important people in the past 100 or so years who, you know, including Mary Elizabeth Lange, who's been considered for sainthood. And in case you want to know how to be considered for sainthood, you can look it up. But what I remember, you have to be nominated by your archbishop. You have to have a proof. You have to have a lifetime of chastity, and you couldn't have got none on the side or got in trouble for getting some. And it's, you know, no. I demonstrated chastity. And you had to perform one or two miracles. You had to perform and have confirmed a miracle or two. That's how you become a saint. Now think who? Father Grace. Daddy Grace. Father Divine. We talked about in the Bailey book, right? Think about them. Miracles. Again, if you put all this reading together, kind of like, But Mary Lange, crucial. Second person is crucial. Augustine Tolton. Tolton. A Chicago brother. He was considered the first black priest in America. Augustus Tolton. First black priest in America. Died pretty early, but he has that distinction. Someone that when I was in school, I learned a lot about were the Healy brothers. You had James Augustine Healy. You had the one I know a lot about, Patrick Healy. And you may know that name because he ended up being the president of Georgetown. You say, how the heck did a black man become a president of Georgetown? Well, the Healy family were actually half black. So Patrick passed. You all know the term passing? Able to pass for white if you identify that way. But if you don't have to. Right. But those are very important black Catholics. James was the first black bishop in America. James Healy, first black bishop in America. I forgot what year, but I want to say like 18. You can look it up. Now I won't get the wrong year, but somewhere in the 1870s, I think. Yeah, should be. You had Patrick, I said, who was the president of Georgetown, and they had another one, brother Sherman, Healy, James Sherman, Sherwood, James Patrick, and Sherwood, and he became a Catholic chancellor. And so those are important names. A lot more, obviously, Wilton Gregory, who I'm about to attach a short video, because he is the highest ranking black person in America right now, Catholic, so it's an important thing. All right, that's it. So I go a little bit long, but it's my thing, man. I ain't get a chance to talk Catholic stuff as much since I don't really practice as devoutly. But as I was married in the Catholic Church, I was married by a priest. I'll die by a priest. I'll die by a priest. I hope not. my mass will be officiated by a priest. God bless you. See you Tuesday.